Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Starr, and today I'm very excited to be talking about this book with its author, Pauline Butcher. This book is called Freak Out, My Life with Frank Zappa, and it is about her time working for Frank Zappa and living in the house at Laurel Canyon. It's an incredible read, and I highly, highly recommend it to anyone who is a fan of Frank Zappa or anyone who's just a fan of memoirs in general. And even if I didn't know who Frank Zappa was, I think this is a really incredible book because, Pauline, your growth throughout the story is really incredible. Just how much you sort of change. And of course, for anyone who does like Frank Zappa, there's tons of really incredible information there. I really want people to read this memoir. And one of the stories that really jumped out to me that I had no idea about was this story about Raven and the bag of blood. And if you could sort of recap that story for everyone without giving away the ending, just because I want people to go and read the book to get the ending. Could you tell us about that?
It was a very hot day. It was about 90 degrees, something like that. And the front door was open, although you could walk into the log cabin anywhere, but it made it easier if the front door was open. And Frank was in the sitting room. It were open directly onto the sitting room. It was a huge room. And this man stood in the doorway, and it was August, and he had a suit on. I mean, we were used to hippies in T-shirts and jeans, and he had a shirt and tie and a suit, and his hair was smarmed down and parted on the side. So unusual. And he said, "Frank Zappa, I brought you a present." And he handed Frank this bag of see-through liquid, red liquid inside. It looked like blood. And Frank took it in a dramatic and theatrical way and held it up to us. And the other people in the room were three of the GTOs and Wildman Fisher, who was also a very frightening character. But anyway, and me. And so while he was handing that bag to us, the guy behind him pulled out a gun. Frank told me later it was a Colt 45. Doesn't mean anything to me, but it might mean something to other people. But anyway, he pointing this at about 2 feet away. Now, Frank, I thought was either stark raving mad or the bravest man I ever knew, because he calmed this bloke down and somehow talked him out of putting the gun down and following him out into the garden to throw it into the pond. And how he did that, I think was related to why he did that. I think was related to the fact that similar with Wildman Fisher. Wildman Fisher was also a very dangerous person. And Frank brought him into the house and sort of treated him as if he knew how to look after him and be humane with him. And if he was humane with him, he would respond in the same way. As it happened, it didn't turn out like that with Wildman Fisher, but that's a later story. But in this case, I think that's what he was thinking here. And somehow the guy said, you know, I don't want to get rid of it. And Frank said, well, if you don't get rid of it, the police will come and they'll put you in jail. And he said, I don't want to go to jail. And he said, well, I know where you can hide it and the police won't find it. So he marched up, making a big show of it, you know, and he indicated for the rest of us to follow, which was madness, really, because the guy had a gun, for God's sake. So we followed out and stood round this pond, which was all algae, and Frank threw a stone into the pond, and he indicated the rest of us to do the same. And then the guy took his gun and dropped it into the pond. I mean, it was extraordinary, really, wasn't it? That happened. So and Frank handed the bloke the bag of blood, walked him down to the gate, which was always open, but he immediately closed it once he pushed him outside, came back in. We all stood in the kitchen, terrified. And I said to Frank, are you going to call the police? You know, why aren't we calling the police? And he said, because if the police come, he'll go to jail and he doesn't deserve to go to jail. I think that the reason he said that was because his real enemy at that time were the police, because he hated them so much. And I know all Zappa fans will know the story of how Frank was hoodwinked by police dressed up as cowboys and wanting a video made of a porno video made.
But like an audio recording or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the next morning they came and arrested him for making a porno. So he was thrown into jail. And as far as he was concerned, that was the most awful time up until then of his life. Yeah. And so the police were the enemy for Frank at that time, not these crazy people.
So even like a man coming to the house with a gun, that didn't cross the threshold of that's a police involvement. That was still it was settled to him just as long as the gun was gone.
Yeah, but I think the context has to be taken into account here as well. The context was that Laurel Canyon at that time, 1968, a year before the Manson murders. So in 1968, Laurel Canyon was like a fairyland, really. It was all pretty. I don't think the heavy drugs had taken hold. Nobody was that bananas at that time. Sure. It was the high life of lovely experiences in Laurel Canyon. So I think it was easy to see this as a sort of, a hijinks sort of thing. Whereas had it happened, I'm quite convinced, had it happened after the Manson murders, it would have been a totally different story.
Frank has this ability to calmly sort of control everyone around him. He doesn't really raise his voice. Everyone sort of hangs on his every word. Why do you think he was able to do that? What about him allowed him to have sort of that magical power over everyone he interacted with?
I think I know the answer to that, although I may be wrong. But I think if you were Frank Zappa, and you are right now listening to me, right, and you're staring at me, you're looking at me, and you're not moving, now that's how he would be. And he would be concentrating, as you are, on every word I say. And then when I got to the end, when I stopped talking, he would then reply in the quietest of voices. So you had to strain to hear him. But not only that, but he also was a man of few words. So there was no ums and ahs and hums and ha's. It was just the few words of what he had to say, and that would be it. So I think that was partly how he did it.
This thing that you talk about in the book is that as a young secretary, he sat down and talked to you as an equal and paid attention and listened to you. And you speak about how that made you feel like important. Is that part of what made you then instantly sort of want to know what he wanted to say because he treated you with such respect?
Yes. I mean, that is what hooked me onto him right at the beginning. Because, of course, when he came to London, when I met him, there was no one looked like Frank Zappa in London at that time. The Beatles had, hair to here, but his was right down here. And, right down here, and this funny moustache, and he just looked so different. He was the first man in 1967, this was, to listen to me. And actually, when I criticized his song, Brown Shoes Don't Make It, I said it was immoral. And to have a 13-year-old girl making love to a middle-aged man on the White House lawn, I said, that's immoral. And he debated with me, which was really so unusual. Nobody took any notice of secretaries in those days. And women, especially in 1967, were treated like dolly birds. They had no status whatsoever, really. And so for this man to take notice of me, I was knocked out. I wanted to meet him again and again, and I pursued that.
Counter to that, though, at the same time, Frank did make sort of sexual advances towards you, right? He was very flirtatious, to put it mildly.
Yeah, he did.
do you think that's what led to him wanting to hire you as a employee, because of that fact that you would debate him, and because he couldn't have you?
Well, there was an element of that. I think that was part of it. Yes, I mean, and so there would have been in the back of his mind, well, if he brought me over to California in the house, there might be another opportunity and I might, succumb or something. I think that was, but in the end, when I got to the log cabin, he made no passes at the log cabin. And we were there for 5 months. And in fact, he treated me more affectionately the whole time I was there. He actually seemed, when he pulled me into his arms in the kitchen one day and said, I like working with you, Pauline. And another time, and he knocked on my door when I was in bed, and he opened, and I said, come in. He opened the door and he said, he'd just come back from his trip, and he said, it's nice seeing you again, Pauline. And those little touches were gobsmacked me, of course. I mean, I was just in awe of him. I loved him. And the thing is that it didn't stop me from seeing his faults. It did not stop me from finding weaknesses in the man. And I think that's what helps the value in my book. But going back to that first time, what was good about it and different from what a lot of men might have been, for example, my sister was seduced by a man and she turned him down. He threw her out of the car into a dark road in a woods or something, and she had to find her way home. And that would be quite a common reaction from a man. Well, now I turned Frank down, and he was completely the opposite. He was a total gentleman about it. He just said, he obviously had this view, I think, that if a woman doesn't want sex, then he's not interested, because he only wanted sex with women who wanted sex. He wasn't interested in forcing himself on anyone. And so I think that redeemed him in my mind. It redeemed him,
Yeah.
And on the other occasion when it happened, the same thing. He seemed to be nicer afterwards than
Now obviously fans of Frank will know that his views on groupies and sex and lust are pretty well documented. Do you think that your relationship with Gail Zappa, his wife, benefited from the fact that you had rejected Frank on multiple occasions, and that she felt that she could trust you or feel safe with you in the house?
Right. Well, it was never mentioned for 2 years. In the first 2 years I was there, she never mentioned how I met Frank or how I got on with him in New York when she was in California and I was in the apartment on my own, which is when the pass was made. Nor did she mention the trip I made to Ottawa, and I was on my own in a hotel room with him there. She didn't mention any of it. So I didn't know what she thought about it until right at the end, when she said she was writing a book about groupies. And she said Frank had told her to write the book, and she was going to interview all the groupies that he'd slept with. I mean, he told her to do this. Can you imagine?
Crazy,
and she said, and I'm going to start with you, Pauline. And I was in the office at the time. I nearly dropped the phone, and I shouted down the phone, I haven't had an affair with Frank. And they all turned around, all the people in the office looked at me and said, oh dear. So I went into the toilet and tried to recover. I thought, I can't cope with this. And then we went and had a coffee, and it turned out that it'd been a misunderstanding, and she came to take me on board, but she never wrote the book. It never got written. Another book that never got written, because I went out there originally to help Frank write a book on politics.
Politics, yeah. Your book spends a good deal of time on the women in Frank's orbit, and Gail in particular. Can you tell us more about Gail Zappa?
Wow. That's a bit of a huge question. I would say my view of Gail is that she was very canny. She was very, very canny. And she decided to take Frank on with his groupies and stay there. But I think it cost her a lot. But she made friends with all the women he brought to the house, because he brought them to the house. The women he wanted to sleep with, he brought to the house. I mean, Laurel Butcher she was with him when he was thrown into police jail. She was with him the night making that video or the audio they made for the police. And she went and lived with them for a year, but they didn't have sex all that time. But Gail told me about this first time it happened when there was a girl staying at the house called Francesca, and Frank wanted to sleep with her, and Gail got all the bedding and took it downstairs, the duvet and the pillows and everything for them to have sex together. She did this because he wanted it, so she was going along with it to keep him on side. She wasn't going to create a fuss. Francesca came back up and said she couldn't do it. Because Gail had made friends with her all that time. She'd got into the skin of this girl, as she did with me. So when Frank made the second attempt in Ottawa on me, I had this very close friendship by that time with Gail, and there was no way I could break that. What else do you need to know about her? She was funny. She was clever. She could tell funny stories. She was charming. She told a lovely funny story about Terence Donovan, who was a top photographer at the time in London, and how when she had sex with him, he would order her like a sergeant major, right leg up, bum down, all this, left leg up and so on. And she described this story. We had this in hysterics, She could tell funny stories. She was very good like that. It's very hard for me to convey a whole picture of Gail.
Since she's passed, there's been some, various conflicts between the Zappa children and so forth, and how the estate was divided. How was she, though, as a mother?
Well, I was there only during Frank's early fame in 1968 to 71. Okay. And I thought she was a wonderful mother. She was devoted to them. And I think one has to be fair to her, because, look, she ended up having 4 children by Frank. But I know, because I wasn't there for the other 2, but I know from, what the pattern that was set, that he never, for example, went to the seaside with all 4 of them, never went to the zoo, never went out as a family, as far as I know. He did not indulge in that kind of family activity. She had to do it all on her own. Mm-hmm. And I thought she was a wonderful mother, and it does seem like toward the end of her life, she went a bit dewlappy, and it's probably not surprising given what she had to suffer. She didn't have to suffer. She could have left. She could have divorced Frank with all these women appearing. Heartbreaking for her, and so humiliating that she had to share him with these other women. And he would not allow her to look at another man. He wouldn't allow her. Mm-hmm. And I asked him this question when I met him in 1988. Why was it that he didn't allow Gail to look at another man? And he said, well, she's my best friend. She's my best friend. And it doesn't work if both parties have affairs. It doesn't work in marriages. If both parties end up, then the marriage breaks up. And he said, I know that's unfair, but that's the way it is. I found her confusing. I found her confusing because I thought we were close friends. And when I was in England, I came back to England, she wrote me loving letters. I have them. You are so good, Pauline. You listen with your heart, all this kind of thing. Really, really gushing words to me. And then after 1988, when Frank stopped coming to London, she stopped writing. And when my book came out, she was horrible about it, you know. So it's very confusing that, you know, I didn't know where I stood. And a lot of people felt that.
Yeah.
They felt her hot and cold, I suppose. Yeah, I need to say that.
Well, that's a really great insight. Thank you. In your book, you talk about how Frank, he eats dinner by himself often. He's almost seems like he's intentionally trying to stay detached from people at times. He's writing his music, don't bother him. And he also he didn't want to argue with the Mothers about how the band should function and break up. Like he everything feels like he pays the band so that they're not an equal member of the band. They're an employee. Do you think that he was sort of cold and detached overall, or is there more to that story?
There was that element to him. And in fact, I find that one of the things I find about some of his music is very clinical for me, as opposed to being emotional. So there is that, you know, discussion between people who are into Frank Zappa's music, which I'm not, you know, equipped to engage in. But I do feel that myself sometimes. But I found him myself very kind and considerate. And he could be cold, like he was with the Mothers of Invention when he broke them up. Out of the blue, no notice. They were paid on a weekly wages, and you would think they would have 2 weeks' notice, but no. He phoned Jimmy Carr Black up when they got back from Ottawa, and said, "I'm breaking up the band. Phone the rest of the guys and let them know." And so when they had a meeting 2 or 3 weeks later, Herb Cohen told them that there was no money in the kitty, but in fact, they owed Frank $10,000. So that was about, between the 8 of them, I think it was about $140 each they owed Frank. They were absolutely not only horrified about the breakup, but they were gobsmacked about that. Yeah. Now, Frank saw how upset they were and said, "Oh, well, okay, guys, let's forget about the 10 grand. Let's call it quits." And then when we moved out of the log cabin, he was a little bit cold, I thought, toward me, because he then said, "Well, you're going to have to find yourself somewhere else to live." And I had no car and I couldn't get around, so I was going to find anywhere to live. But I think in the background, he did take care of me, because his lawyer offered me his house to live in, which was just along the road from Frank and Gail's new house. I lived there rent-free in return for looking after his animals, which was the zoo, and cleaning the house, which was a nightmare because of all the animals. Yeah. With another guy who was in love with Pamela Zarubica, who was Susie Creamcheese. She was living in the house as well. No idea why or what the mystery about that was. But anyway, she was living there, and this friend of Calvin's lived at the upstairs, and he fell in love with her, and she rejected him and said, "I'm not having an affair with a straight guy from Philadelphia," or something like that, how she talked. And he went mad and put black paint all over her red walls in her room. And I thought he was going to kill himself. So I rushed up and got Frank and said, "Look, you know, can you talk to him? I think it's serious." And Frank went and talked to him. He said, "What's the matter? Won't she fuck you or something?" So he said, "Yeah, whatever." So he offered to give him $10 a week for helping in the house here and there, and patted him on the head. And that was him. You would think he'd been offered money out for one of his songs, you know, the way he was so beaming afterwards. But anyway, Frank took care of that. I think those are small illustrations of his kindness, but certainly with the Mothers, he was cold. They complained about that.
Yeah. You know, here you are, you're living in the house. You're extremely close, but yet there's some barrier to ever being truly close with them. And it's not like you're a member of a family. You're still this employee that sort of lives on the outskirts of their life, even though you're in the house with them.
Yes.
How did that make you feel?
Oh, I didn't mind that at all. I didn't mind that at all. And interestingly enough, Gail would say, I'm an employee just like everybody else. That's how she felt. I mean, Frank didn't treat her really any better than anyone else in the house. You know, he ate alone. He didn't eat with her. He didn't spend any time with her except in bed. That's the only time he seemed to spend with her. I only saw them together once on the sofa in the 5 months that we were there, and that was early in their marriage. That was very early. You'd think they would have been more like a couple of lovebirds then, but no, they weren't at all. And he did seem to ignore her. I think he told me at the end that she was his best friend, and I said, well, how can you have sex with your best friend? And he said, well, sex is very silly, isn't it? And this was after all those years, he told me to get on with it and stop being such a prude. And, you know, have sex and don't think about it. Have sex and don't put love in the bracket. It's nothing to do with love. Sex is just sex. And just get on with it and enjoy it. And then all of a sudden at the end in 1988, he told me, well, sex is very silly. And so he'd obviously, I think his illness by that taken over, presumably not into it so much. And so he wasn't bothered about the fact that Gail was his best friend and he didn't need to have sex with her. And presumably with no one else, I don't know.
Very early on in your first meetings with Frank, people are calling him a genius right away. Did he surround himself with yes men or just fawning groupies?
I don't think so, no. But I think it's the other way around. He was so formidable that people were afraid to say boo to him. And the mothers didn't. They complained to Herbie, but they didn't seem to complain to Frank. Gradually, he overtook with the mothers, and they grumbled within themselves and not to Frank. Jimmy Carl Black was the most vocal because he actually had started the group, of course. I think it was because he was so formidable.
Yeah.
When he was working, Moon was not allowed into the living room where he worked. He worked in the living room. She was not allowed. There was an open door. It was an open square through to the second room and then the kitchen over there. And she was not allowed in there while he was working. And we were not allowed to interrupt him. It was like he was surrounded by a shield that you couldn't penetrate. And we used to tiptoe through because he worked and you had to go through the living room to get down to the basement to go to the rehearsals, or go down to my room, or go to Pamela's room. And people used to come and see her and go across the room. So people used to tiptoe through and he would ignore everybody. And that's the other strange thing about it, isn't it? We had 11 of us living at that house, 11 of us. And he ignored us all. So why did he have so many people living there? He didn't want to, he didn't talk to anyone. One time out of the 5 months, he came into the kitchen and socialized, only once. So I think when he came back from New York, he wanted the log cabin, which was huge. He wanted to establish himself as the king of Laurel Canyon. That's what that house established, because there were the others. They were much younger, of course, in their 20s, 19, 18, all those young people, they were much younger. He was 29, or 28, something like that. And and he was old for his age as well, wasn't he? He was very old in his manner. So he didn't want to socialize with any of those people, and he did not surround himself. No, the only people that he saw were the people in the house, and we weren't allowed to talk to him either.
It's really fascinating. It's so fascinating. To speak about music for a moment, you paint several pictures of sort of Frank at the piano writing music, the details of how cleanly he writes his manuscripts, his passion for always writing music at all times. I know that he rehearses with the Mothers in the basement once a day, but do you ever see him sort of just sit and practice, like play scales on his guitar, or just do none of that?
No, it's very odd, isn't it?
It's very odd.
He would, what do you call it? Tinker, and that's not quite the right word, is it, for a guitar? What would you say?
It's just sort of noodle.
Yes, that sort of thing. You might find him when he was relaxing, just trying out a few little, but nothing like he would be on stage, never. And he did not use the guitar to compose. He used the piano. Everything was composed on the piano with his, he had stick-like fingers, and he would pick out the tune on the piano, and he would write it down, and he might put in a few chords, but then when he'd written all the different parts, then he would get Ian Underwood. This was when I was there. I mean, I don't know how it went later, but this is when he would get Ian Underwood to play the parts for him. He would listen to it for the first time, and he would hear it, because he couldn't play with both hands, complicated piano pieces. He couldn't play it.
Now,
so he had it in his head.
Yeah. Now,
he said, sometimes I know what it's going to sound like, and other times I have no idea until I hear it.
Now, you studied piano when you were younger, is that correct?
I had played piano up until quite a high level, but I did not play it while I was there, because I could only play with music. I couldn't play by ear, and I didn't have my music with me, so I couldn't remember that. I would get halfway through and forget. So I did play on the piano when he was asleep, but never when he was there, no.
How do you think he would have
I did actually fancy myself playing with the band one time in San Francisco. I thought, wouldn't that be nice to be up there with them? But no, that was a momentary. It was a momentary thing. I was more interested in writing the books, which never got written.
Yeah. How do you think he would have reacted if you had played some piano sonata or something?
Oh, I don't know. Well, I don't think he would have been very interested if I didn't play well. I don't know. I can't answer that question. No, I can't answer.
Now, he encouraged you a lot to pursue sort of these other tasks. He gave you really what I view as management of the GTOs.
Yes, well, looking after the girls was a nightmare, because they were all drug addicts, and I had no idea about drugs. And when Cinderella was sniffing in the back of my car like this, and I said to her, I was driving them to the TV studios for an interview, and I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Oh, nothing, Pauline. It's just my smelling salts." And I said, "Oh, smelling salts? I thought they went out with my grandmother." And so when we got to the studio, I told her to take her smelling salts. And when they got back, I got this phone call from Gail. She said, "Get your butt over here," she said. "Frank's furious." And oh my God, what have I done now? I said, "Well, it wasn't my fault they failed the audition. I thought that's what he was going to complain about, because they failed the audition." I got there and he said, this was one bit of dialogue that I had trouble repeating, actually, because he was angry. So I don't know how quite if I got the words right, because he said, "What the fuck do you think you're doing, telling the girls to take cocaine in this, in the TV studio?" I thought, oh my God, it was cocaine. I thought, I didn't realize. I thought it was smelling salts. They told me it was smelling salts. I believed them, silly me. And then he was furious with me, and I said, "Well, why is my head on the block when I'm not the one who was taking the blasted stuff? They were. So why is my head on the block?" I was furious. I really blasted at him for giving me a hard time, which saved me actually, because he calmed down then.
Do you think that helped you to gain sort of confidence that you could be more than just a secretary?
Yes, and he had it in his head that I would go to the office and be an executive there, but I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to work 9 till 5. I had never done that, so I didn't want to do it. So but I did want to be a journalist. That was my big thing.
How did you actually go about writing this book? It's incredibly detailed. You have quotes in there that I'm reading them and it sounds just like I would imagine Frank said it right at the time. What was your process?
I could not have done it without the fact that my mother kept all my letters in a box. And when I first got there, don't forget, I was totally like out of kilter with everyone there. I didn't have my first pair of jeans until I'd been there 6 months. I just wore straight dresses. I was groomed. They were all hippies and looked like scallywags. So I definitely looked different. And I think that Frank liked that, of course. Of course, that gave him status, didn't he? He had his own secretary living in his house. And how many rock stars had that? So, and not only that, an English one. I wrote home 20-page letters every week, single-spaced, to my family and friends, because I wanted them to experience this all extraordinary experience I was going through. Share it with me. I wanted them to have it. And of course, they wrote back a gog, absolutely. I could not believe it, what I was telling them. So that happened. But then gradually, I got drawn into it, gradually. And I became a person in the scene, in Frank Zappa's world. And I was unable to be objective as I went on. So that is illustrated in the book, because there's 200 pages on the 5 months we were at the log cabin, which is when I wrote all the letters, and only 100 pages on the next 2 years. So, I had to write it from memory, mostly because I stopped writing my diary, and I wrote fewer letters home. It was all in my letters, what people were wearing, what they were, but as far as the dialogue is concerned, well, I mean, here's an example. Frank, for example, told me that he had met a girl out west who could have an orgasm from stimulation of her nipples. Now, I had to put that in dialogue. Well, it seemed to me that Frank would say that in a very straightforward way. And that's how I put it, I met a girl out west. I had to make up what he said, but it wasn't too difficult. Like, for example, when I first met him and when he first made that first pass at me, and he said in that, after he'd made a pass, and he had a little thing, and he said, well, do you think if we fucked? Which I had never heard that word before, I have to tell you. I was so prim. I'd never heard, nobody used that word in Twickenham anyway, and not maybe on building sites, but not where I lived. And so when he said that, that shook me. Do you think if we fucked, you could still work for me? And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, he'd only tickled my boobs or something, nothing more. And here he was talking about this, and I said, no, well, I think I was horrified. I thought, well, is it my fault because I'm here in the apartment at 1 o'clock in the morning? I mean, did I give him that come on by doing that? But he'd offered me the job, so I thought we were employer-employee. I didn't think we were in that sort of base. But anyway, that's what he said to me, and I fluffed a silly reply, something like, well, you might think it was okay, and I might think it was okay, but then we might not think it was okay, or something. I made up some silly, and he said, yes, I think so too. But I mean, I think that's what he said.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is your own growth. You start very early on. You're enamored with this idea of going to Hollywood. Frank is a celebrity. this whole world that you're being exposed to. And by the end of the book, it feels like as a person you've evolved, and you sort of see him as through a different lens now. What do you think about your experience allowed you to grow and view him differently?
Well, the big factor in that was women's liberation. That's what changed it for me. They came onto the headlines in 1969, and they were braless, marching and demonstrating, "Love me less, respect me more" was their slogan. And I read Kate Millett's book on women's liberation, and I thought it was wonderful. I was knocked out by it. And at that time, don't forget, it's hard to imagine, there were no women in Richard Nixon's cabinet. No, there were. I think there were two women in the House of Representatives. That's all. There was no representation of women by women. It shook me up. It totally made me think, well, I can do more than what I'm doing. I can be more than a secretary. So, of course, I chased up to Frank, thinking he was for the underdog, so he would support women's rights. No, it was completely the opposite. He thought they were all dykes, wouldn't have anything to do with it. Why do you want to carry a suitcase? Why do you want to be like a man? Oh, I actually had that conversation with him, and I'd done all this reading, and I actually knew more about the subject than he did. When Gail said, why are they arguing? There's, women are 50% of the population. I said, yes, but they don't have any power. Women don't have any power. They're not in the army. They're not in the jurisdiction. They're not in the law or anywhere. They had no power, and it's got to change. That was the crack in my break from Frank. And then, of course, I applied to go to university, and of course he was against university. His 4 children did not go to university because he discouraged them from doing so. He thought it was the worst thing. They should go to the library. I think they missed out. But anyway, I was determined not to miss out, because I had missed out on university earlier, which is a totally separate story. I won't bore you with that. But so I said, I want to go to UCLA. And he said to me, I want to study journalism. I said, because I wanted to be a journalist. Why do you want to go to the university? They'll turn you out like all the other journalists, and you'll be asking the same silly question. And I said, well, no, I still contradicted him when I wanted. And I said, no, I need the help. I can't do it. He said, well, send the pieces off that you write and just keep sending them. Don't be afraid to fail. Don't worry about failure. It's very rare to succeed. It's more normal to fail. So get used to failing and just keep doing it. Anyway, as it happened, I came back and I went to Cambridge University instead. And I had the choice of going back to Frank, and I thought, no, I've been there, done that. I needed to move on, and I did.
Now, this point you make here, there's sort of 2 things you talk about. Feeling that you knew more about the subject than he did when regards to women's liberation. You'd educated yourself, and then also this oft-repeated line that Frank learned everything because he went to the library. But in the book, one of the things that stuck out to me is that you mentioned that he never reads the newspaper. He's not watching television, which was maybe not as prevalent as it is today, wasn't reading books, wasn't taking those continued steps to continually stay informed and engaged. And instead, he was very opinionated, very confident in his opinions. I thought that was just sort of this unique contrast. And then he also is susceptible to, government conspiracies about smoking, or he talks about diva being psychic. This sort of 2 sides of a coin, this I'm Mr. Smart, I know everything, but also not wanting to educate himself on other things. Can you explain that at all?
I think during the period I was there, he did not watch television. He didn't read books, although Robert Plant gave Gail Aleister Crowley's book on, the otherness of life. And I think he was strongly influenced by Aleister Crowley, especially in that notion of do whatever you want as long as it's not a murder. I think he got quite a few ideas from Aleister Crowley's book. I think later on, as I've seen, he was fascinated by news later on and watched CNN.
Yeah.
And I think when he was on the road, he read newspapers. When he was on the road, he read magazines. So it was just in the house he didn't bother with these things. And when we were there and when the children were young, when I was there, and Moon was 3 years old, she had not seen television when she was 3 years old. They did not have a television in the house. But that obviously changed later when they became teenagers. They must have rebelled and insisted or something. And he himself got involved in it. So there was, interestingly, when Mick Jagger came to the house, he came to the log cabin, and they sat in the kitchen and talked politics. The guy who shot Martin Luther King, he was arrested in London, and Mick Jagger talked about him, and Frank Zappa did not know, and neither did any of us know that he had been arrested. It was that kind of thing. In the log cabin, we were so enclosed. I mean, there was a revolution going on in France. Nobody was the least bit interested. But later on, I do think he became more worldly and started, as you saw in his later life, he became interested in European politics.
Sure.
I think that changed.
Yeah. I think as early as 68 or 69, he's already talking about wanting to run for president.
In about July, a day after Robert Kennedy was shot, that's how the conversation came up. And we found out that Robert Kennedy had died. And Frank said, I'm thinking of running for president. This is, again, another example of how I had to make up what he said, because obviously he said this to me, but I don't know exact words he said.
Sure.
But I think he would have just said it as simply as that. I'm thinking of running for president. And of course, I was gobsmacked because he couldn't even run the log cabin household, let alone a government. But anyway, I tried to not show my disbelief by saying, if you run for president, you might be assassinated. And he said, I think I will be anyway.
You have a note to this edition, and you write in here, I also feel that in light of the MeToo movement, certain scenes have taken on a new significance since I first published the book. Can you sort of talk about how the book changed as MeToo movement changed our view on power dynamics?
In this edition, when I first wrote the book, I thought I wanted to call it Zappa's Women. And I concentrated on all the women, in like the GTOs and Pamela Zerubica and Gail, and these other women. I concentrated on those. When I kept, over the years, I was able to look back a bit more objectively, because the book, because it's from my diaries and from my letters, it's very much in the moment. So it's not me making a judgment, Yeah. So I thought, as the time went on, I thought it's really the stories about Frank, Gail and me and the problems that we had. That's really the interesting part, I think. And I had a bit more confidence then to sort of channel it that way. So the story's the same. It's just channeled, and all the stuff about Gail is brought together. All the stuff about GTOs is brought together. The Mothers of Invention, their stuff is all brought together. Before, it was all over the place. It wasn't properly structured. So I think now it gives a clearer view of my journey, as you've yourself described.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a really wonderful because it's through your eyes. Like I was reading it and I felt like I could relate to it as this outsider who's suddenly thrown into this world and this absorbing it all, and then eventually sort of being able to have an objective view on it as you've progressed. It's really fantastic. So it's a great book. You studied psychology, is that what you, and then that's that what you taught, right?
I did. I taught psychology. Over here in England, it's A level. It's a level before university, but I think it's equivalent to first year university in America.
As someone who's now, studied and understands psychology, like, does that also change the way that you view how he interacted with people?
I think, yes. I mean, I have actually reassessed some of his attitude toward women. It's really quite awful.
Yeah.
Really quite awful, really. Some of the ways he was. But yet, to me, he was such a gentleman, really. I mean, he made those chances, but I can't blame him for that because that was the situation. It was almost like set up, really. Yeah, looking back on him now, I do reassess and I look at his songs. The lyrics in his songs are terrible, some of them. Shocking. I mean, Crew Slut, I asked him about that when I saw him. Crew Slut. Why would you call a girl a crew slut? Don't make a fuss, get on the bus. I mean, what attitude is that? Well, he's pretending he's a reporter.
Yeah.
He's pretending he's a reporter. But, people write about stuff that's within themselves. And I do think that Moon, for example, she wore cover-up clothes from here down to here till Frank died, really. And I do feel that she felt really quite embarrassed by the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's a disgusting, horrible, in my opinion, attitude toward women in that. But then his defense was that he wrote terrible lyrics about men as well.
Did you feel when you worked for him, did you ever feel objectified?
Objectified? No, never. No, I felt he saw me as a human being. I felt he saw me as someone who should be a writer. He encouraged me to write. He encouraged me. He was the only man I'd ever met who said, write about this experience, put it all down, send it off. He encouraged me, as he encouraged his musicians as well to excel. So he had that ability. So no, I never felt objectified, never, no.
Well,
interestingly, he was very protective about the women around him. His sister, when she told him that she was sleeping around, he was disgusted.
mm-hmm.
He showed disgust. And when after I stopped working for him, got a job in the local dance land where you got paid 10 cents for a dance, and I told him about it, he was upset about that and gave me $300 in order to stop me working there. He kept Gail totally under lock and key. It was interesting, that bit about his attitude towards the women around him, if we're talking about him objected. So I did not feel objectified whatsoever.
He seems to be a man of many contrasts. His views on sex and lust, and then also a protectiveness at the same time about the women around him.
Yes. Yes.
He wants to write, complicated, music. He wants only the finest musicians. Yet you talk about at 200 Motels, he's making fun of sort of the studio musicians that are coming in because they're classical musicians that are only going to be second violin or something. And
I know.
There's like
that was horrible, wasn't it? That really was a cold part of him.
Yeah.
And when he made 200 Motels, I mean, they tore up their outfits when they finished, and he was upset about that. But what did he expect when he said all this stuff about them?
Yeah.
That they were losers. I mean, I can't imagine what was in his mind when he said that.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to reconcile that with what I saw, because I was so enamored with him as this brilliant, wonderful, magnificent man.
How do you think your time in the Zappa world, how do you think that later affected you after you left and you later met your husband and you continued your life beyond that? How did those things influence you still?
When I got back to England, I was very ill, and it took me a year and a half to recover. And I was debating whether to go back to America or whether to stay in England. I found, because people, knew I'd worked for Frank Zappa, and I found that that's all people wanted to know about was Frank Zappa, because here was somebody who actually worked for him. By that time, his name was quite well known in England. And I met my husband in Cambridge. We went up to Scotland. When we got there, for the next 10 years, I didn't mention, maybe 7 or 8 years, I didn't mention Frank Zappa's name. I didn't tell anyone up in Scotland that I worked for him, because I just felt I didn't exist outside of him. And so I had our son was born up there, and I wanted that life and with my husband. And so it wasn't until I came back to England and started teaching that I knew my A-level students would be interested in Frank Zappa. So, of course, I brought it back in again. So, of course, they had a teacher who worked for Frank Zappa. That was really quite something. And I didn't start writing the book until my son was at university himself, 18 years later.
What inspired you to write the book?
I wanted to be a writer all my life, and I tried to get a play on the BBC. And one of the BBC people told me, write something that no one else can write. And the only thing that no one else could write was my experience working for Frank Zappa. That was the only reason it came up. And so I started off as a play, and then I sent off to all the publishers. And I got 12 back, and they said, yes, send us the chapters. Well, I hadn't written anything, because I'd been writing a play. So I quickly write some chapters. And that's how I knew I had a marketable product, when 12 people wrote back and said that. 2014, the BBC Radio 4 did a radio adaptation of it. They did a radio play. They made it into a romance between Frank and I, and it was a bit embarrassing. And with this heavy breathing, I was listening to it through my hands, oh my God. And there's a film possibly in the offing.
Wow. How did Gail react when the book was first published?
Apparently she hated it. She was very rude about it. And she got misinformed about an interview I did with the top program here on Radio Today program, the very first interview I did. And the woman tricked me into saying about Frank's funeral. And she said, did you go to Frank's funeral? And I said, no, no one went, only Gail and the 4 children. And she said, what do you think? None of Frank's family went, for example. And she said, what do you think about that? And I said, I think it was terrible. And I said, but you're not going to publish this, surely. It's nothing to do with me. I mean, there's nothing in my book about this. But she did. She put it in the broadcast. And somehow Gail got told that I made a comment about Frank's mother's funeral, which I never did. I didn't even know when it happened. So she got that cockeyed, and she said she had the cheek to say something about that. And also it says my life with Frank Zappa, and she was only here 4 years. Oh, well, she reduced that down to 2. And she was really quite rude, and she said she hadn't read it, but I don't know whether, I mean, I think she was writing her own book at the time, and I think it would have been very helpful for her if she had written her own, and I hope Moon's using it as well, because it gives her an insight into what that was like. And I think Frank would have liked it too, because it documented that period he wanted documented.
Have you ever spoken to Moon since she was a little kid?
She did post on her Facebook page a picture of books on her bedside table, and my book was there.
Oh,
The old one, the original one, yes. But she's never answered. I did write to her. She didn't answer, so I left it at that. Yeah, I'm looking forward to her book, by the way, of course.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, she's a brilliant writer. She's very good.
Jeff Beck is featured in the book, and David Crosby is mentioned, and they both recently passed away. Is there any sort of memories about them that you would like to share with viewers?
David Crosby came to the house with Joni Mitchell the first night Frank came back from New York, and they came to see him. I did not know who they were because they were West Coast musicians, and I did not know. I just arrived from England, and we didn't know anything about these West Coast people, or at least I didn't. I mean, for goodness sake, I just knew about the Beatles and Rolling Stones. That was about it. Dave Clark 5. So they were there, and I took no interest in them whatsoever. I was too tired anyway. So I didn't talk to him or didn't have any conversation with either of them. Frank did. They never came again, and that's because Frank did not hang out with rock stars. After 4 days of being in the log cabin, he really showed no interest in them, and they all stopped coming, except Mick Jagger did come 3 times, and I have a whole chapter on him in the book. As far as Jeff Beck was concerned, he came several times with Rod Stewart, and one time we got back, Frank and I and Gail were at the studio, and we came home one night, and they were in the kitchen with 2 of the GTOs having a food fight, chucking food around, and Frank walked through with his nose in the air, didn't say a word, and I was left to sort of be like, you know, the tyrant, and saying, look, I hope you're going to clear this up. And he said, come on, girls, you know, or Rod Stewart, get it cleared up, and sort of thing. That was the first time I met them, but the next time they came to the house, they weren't drunk, and they were quite civilized. But I did not have a lot to do with any of the rock stars that came, except Mick Jagger. I did have more to do with him.
During your time there, you formed a relationship with Calvin Schenkel, right? The artist?
Yes.
Can you tell us just a little bit about him and that relationship?
Well, it was wonderful for me. But he had so many women after him. He was very, very attractive. He still is, but he was very, very attractive. And we were like brother and sister for 18 months. And then all of a sudden this happened one night, because he used to sleep in my bed. He could never get back home. He would, you know, he was chaos, really, Calvin's life. But so it happened. I absolutely adored him. I absolutely adored him. He was wonderful. He was so gorgeous. But there were all these other women, and I wasn't capable of fighting back. I wasn't capable. I gave up. He was an interesting character. He did all this strange artwork, and he helped me. He came over to the house and cooked dinner for me, and I lent him my car. That's how we did it.
Once again, to anyone who's watching, I highly recommend picking up this book. I'll have links, obviously, in the description where everyone can find more information about it. Pauline, thank you very much. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we go?
I think you've been wonderful yourself, you know. Very good interviewer you are. You push into depths that, you know, I wouldn't otherwise have found, probably. So very good.
Well, there's some other really great interviews with you online, too, that people, if they want to know more, they can watch those as well. And I wanted to sort of make sure we dug in really deep into some of the good content here. So it's great. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much.
All right.
So we're cut off now, are we?
Yes.
Finished now. So can I just say,